a video talking about my favorite deck. I hope it's my favorite deck. I've played quite a lot of it. Yeah, so as the sort of meta settles, I'm going to end up doing a written guide because I know people like that, and then I'll put it up on my Metafy, which links are somewhere for that. But yeah, as the meta sort of settles, I think we're finally getting to a point now where the shiny cards aren't as shiny anymore. People have figured out what they want. Everyone wants their playset of Tamatoas, has them. Everyone wants their playset of Scrooges, has that playset. And all the cards for the other colors as well. I'm mainly talking about Sapphire because Ramping seems so strong right now. But yeah, the meta sort of settled down, and I think Kiwi is in a fairly decent spot. I don't believe it's the tier 1, tier 0. It might be a tier 1 deck, but I don't think it's a tier 0 deck. And I think it preys on a lot of circumstances in the meta, really. I've got a version of my current list on the screen. That's sort of where we're at. But I've gone over to this website. I was going to do my own tier list, but I could not find a site to do it. And I found Lorcana.gg that they'd done their own, and the data is all fed in from tournament results. So looking at this, I actually generally did. I think it was a very good understanding of where the meta is at. I think, yeah, of course, these sort of decks down here, which are very interesting, sort of meta decks, they're still meta viable, but they are down in like a tier 3. Maybe the Tramp Bog deck would be into tier 2, but this is all just fed in data. And then, yeah, I think these other ones as well, they didn't get the power cards they really needed. So Amber Steel maybe could be into tier 2 as well. I think Amethyst Ruby maybe has dropped down to tier 2 as well. And Emerald Steel, I think at some point will jump up into that tier 1 spot when it gets going and we get enough like players on it and stuff. Like as I say, one of the big players to buff that deck is Zan. He's always been the one who does well on it, and then people play it, and then it does really well. On top of that, we haven't had any DLC reports, so like I'm pretty sure there's a bunch of good Green Steel players with their new Space Pete's playing locally that have these awesome builds, but we just don't see them because we don't get DLC results. And I think the same can be said about Amber Steel. And until recently, when Ruby Amethyst, sorry, did quite well, those as well. And then we get into the tier 1 decks, and I think I'm very surprised Amber Steel is in there, but I know people will like it a lot. I think it's a very cheap deck to build as well, and you'll get a lot of a turnout for that. And yeah, these Sapphire decks definitely are taking the strongest spots because they got the Bell, they got Scrooge, and they got Tamatoa. Um, and I think definitely on top of everything, Ruby Sapphire. I will get into, by the way, I think because this video I'm going to title um, why you'd want to play this deck in this set. I will get into that. I just want to sort of explain where I think the meta is at first. So yeah, I think definitely Ruby Sapphire sits at the top. I think because it's a control deck, it didn't know really what it wanted to control for the first few turns. Like if you look at the first week, we had like Oswald in there. You know, we had Lady in the Tramp decks. We had Amber still not really knowing what it wants to do as well. The DKP list, which was the most popular Ruby Sapphire list before this set, you know, could we still play that? We don't know if that's still viable. So Ruby Sapphire didn't really know what it needed to control. But now we've kind of got to a point now where the meta is settling down and it knows what it needs to control. It goes, right, so these are the top contender decks. How do I beat them? And they can start putting in like answers to Dime, like Hideaway and Cusco. They can just fully commit now to the Sapphire Coil, Sisu, and then they go, wait, we can put Medusa in here as well. We can put the little Sisus, we can put Brawl, we can put so many cards in there. And we're learning when we can play the coil because a lot of people were, should we just play the coil on 2 into a human Sisu? And I think people are learning, no, if you play it when you're at 5 ink, you can also play it and get a payoff as well and spend those previous turns doing ramp and stuff like that. If you went Porpsicle, ramp, Hiram, coil plus Sisu, you know, you've still got a very good curve there of things that are going on. And you don't even need to use the coil straight away. You can just set it up and wait for the big CC payoff. So I think now that they've figured themselves out, the control decks tend to always rise to the top. That's just the way it is. Once it knows what it wants to control against, it's in a really good spot. Sapphire Steel items as well. I think, yeah, definitely the power, just the power level of that deck. It can outrace the Ruby Sapphire deck because it just will out resource them in the end. You know, you've got big Tamatoa, little Tamatoa. You're constantly feeding through items. You're constantly saying checkmate every turn. You know, if you don't deal with this little Tamatoa, I'm probably going to get a free dime. And if you don't deal with the big Tamatoa, you know, he's going to quest for like 12 lore or whatever. So that definitely has to be a tier 1 contender deck. It does have its weak spots. It does brick itself. But yeah, it definitely deserves to be in there. It feels like sometimes when you play against them, your only real game plan is hoping that they don't get to do all of their broken stuff like Bell, Sail, Porp, Scrooge or whatever, or like get their free Scrooges later on in the game. You kind of just hope they don't do any of those things. So I think the quicker decks make them kind of have to answer these things, like Amethyst Steel, and if you've got an Amber Steel aggro, and of course Sapphire Steel aggro, like all these decks just kind of tend to force responses very early on, so they don't get to their later game plan, when they're playing Scrooge for free and they're playing Big Tamatoa and Little Tamatoa. Um, so I think aggro definitely still has a place in the meta. And for still aggro, it's probably like the fairest deck in the meta. Like if your opponent can do a 3/3 on turn one with Bell into ramping into like 4/4s and just huge dime targets and throwing loads of items at you, and your deck is just going to go Chernobog, Smee, White Rose or whatever. It's very fair. It tends to never brick. It tends to have enough one drops as well that you're always going to have something to play on that turn. It's Amethyst, so it's consistent in drawing cards. So yeah, we've seen it win some events. It does very, very well. It definitely has a place in the top one. I just surprised they've put that in top one, but like I say, this is just data fed into a table here, so it deserves to be there. But I'd imagine some of these other decks that are in tier two also deserve to be in there. We'll probably see a shift as the sets go on. Sapphire Steel aggro. So right at the start, yep, this is sort of the meat and veg of the entire video here. This is the point I click record. At the start of the set, like I saw Artifax's attempt, or his version of Code Nuts Curve, Sapphire Steel, sorry. And he was sort of conflicted on if it's an aggro style list, if it's a control list. I think he said to me that it's in the interview that it's very much like the way Ruby Amethyst used to play. Like if it's a matchup where you just have to aggro them and just play your two questers out and turn sideways, you could do that. But you could also lean on the Hiram and the big Tamatoa that he includes in that list to resource drain them and make it very awkward for them, and finish the game with a bunch of big um, Muktuk manas down just to carry over the line. So there was a lot going on there, and that kind of interested me. I really wanted to try that. I'd played a lot of Kiwi, I played a lot of Alice Pluto over the sets. So I tried it out and I sort of dropped Alice Pluto for a while. And then a weekend happened and I saw Alice Pluto just doing so well. It performed so well because it's still very good. If you were to put the Alice Pluto lock in, it would affect every deck sort of here. All the discard decks, not going to like that your stuff is on the board and it's got ward, and they are going to kind of be a bit like, oh, I don't know what to do here. I've took all the cards out of his hand, but he's still questing for 5 every turn, or 5 or 4 if you played Alice Pluto Cogsworth. Oh, how do I actually break that? I've just been investing in singers. And the same can be said for Amber Steel and the Steel decks as well. It's like, oh, okay, I've controlled their border, I've done what I can, and I've set up my stuff, but they've got an Alice, Pluto, and Cogsworth, and they are warded up and they're questing for a lot of lore every turn, and I have no way to interact with it. So it's still very good. Sapphire Steel aggro, the Kiwi style deck in the Steel meta. There's a lot of ways they can't interact with it. The sad thing is the Ruby Sapphire, the Ruby answers, which are the best answers to Alice and Pluto because they can just blow it all up with whatever they want, with any of their red removal, is still at the top. So we kind of get this weird gatekeeping meta where I think this deck can beat a lot of these decks, and then lose to this deck. And I think all of these decks can lose to this one. But what I would say is, if you're the type of player who likes to play a consistent deck, and maybe you've been playing Kiwi and Aggro Sapphire Steel for so long, I would say just stick on it. I think there's no reason for this couldn't win a DLC or an event compared to any of the other lists as well. We're not doing anything broken with the Scrooges or the Tamatoas, but Alice and Pluto is still a very consistent line to do. Versus some of these decks, I think Ruby Sapphire and Sapphire Steel items, you're generally just hoping that they don't get to do their best line, which to be honest with you, they don't all the time. And sometimes as well, if you're just going to do this very simple line of play Bell, play a 2 drop that quest for 2, play Alice, ward something up, and just turn everything sideways, and they're like, well, I have to do Pawp into Sail, into Find Ramp, into Find My 4 drop, into Set Up Removal, into... They're having to do all these things, and sometimes you can just skill gap a player by the fact that your deck is not that complicated and convoluted. And sometimes as well, anyone can play a very good hand in Lorcana as long as you know what the hand is. But playing from a bad hand takes quite a lot of skill. So as long as you don't get into Sailor or DKP or someone like that, you should be fairly fine into a lot of these Ruby Sapphire players. And as well, even in practice in the reps, it comes out with quite even results as well for this deck and the other 2 decks. But yeah, I think because the Ruby Sapphire and the Sapphire Steel items have Scrooge and Tamatoa, and these cards are so impactful when you play them on the board, they do so much. it does make us look like we're falling a little bit behind. We aren't really. Bell turn 1 is still insane. Bell singing Let the Storm Rage On can still win you a ton of games. So if you look at the meta share, like add up the percentage here, add up the percentage here, here as well. That's a great deal of the meta, and then of course there's a big chunk of it here where you kind of have to try and find your wins as well against it. But yeah, it's felt very consistent, and for me, I've tried to play the other two decks because I can do, because I just have the cards and it's worth the testing. But the mirrors feel horrible. The same way Sapphire Steel aggro mirrors feel horrible as well. But I think then that comes down to, right, so I'm going to play one of the top meta decks. Which one do I want to play? Which one do I feel the most comfortable on? And which one can I win when it's got a bad hand? And if it is this deck, definitely go for it. If it's one of the other decks, go for them as well. But I think we're at a point where it's just such a strong contender for winning a DLC. It's definitely a strong pick. It's not to say it doesn't have some of its bad matchups in the meta share as well. But yeah, I think it's still very strong contender, and I'll keep doing sort of different guides on how to play the deck because it's what I've stuck with. And for me, yeah, as I say, I tried to play like ramp a few times now, and every time I'm just like, I don't want to have to do these mirrors. And I think with Sapphire Steel, the ramp decks, or as it's been classed as the item decks, the mirrors were always horrible. They're even worse now that they're just really long and grinding, and you have to basically just keep trading back and forth. And I just pretty much want to quit the game when I do them. I've always been quite a quick player. And before Sapphire Steel used to be great because you never really got many mirrors. You used to just play against other decks and try and do your game plan and try and counter them. But now you basically like, how do I tech this deck just to beat mirrors or beat other Sapphire decks? So um, yeah, it's kind of just not really vibing with me this set. But yeah, this tier list, I'll probably put a link in the description to it as well. I think it's a very good example of you could pick any of these, and I think on the right day they would definitely be able to win an entire event. So I think Sapphire Steel aggro is in a very very good spot. It's very hard unless you're sort of a red deck that just ramps to like a big removal. Alice plus Pluto is still very strong. It still counters an incredible amount of the meta here. Um, I think as well, if you look at the list for the, I don't think we can improve the Ruby Sapphire matchup too much more. So it's just trying to improve the Sapphire Steel items or Sapphire Steel ramp matchup. And we've kind of gone down the same route that Amber Steel was going down. We're just going to put X4s in the deck and say like, oh, that's going to be really awkward for you. And if you can go like that, Belle into Anna, into Alice, into Pluto or Scrooge or Hiram, into Cogsworth, full quest. It's like a two-turn clock at that point, or two or three-turn clock. And as I say, that's a very consistent and easy thing to do compared to their deck where they have to ramp, find the answers continuously. They have to progress their win con whilst also trying to slow down your win con, and all you've got to do is just basically progress your win con and ward up and resist up. So yeah, I think if you want to keep playing the deck, I still have quite a bit of faith in it being able to perform very well. It's won events over weekend so far, ranging sizes from like 60 to hundreds, and it's I got a top 8 in the CCS, which I'll admit was an insane top cut for 300 people to top 8, so very good. Props to the player who managed to do that. And it will still be around. I do think we're getting tech for, which kind of sucks, but I'm pretty sure there's not much to tech. There's not much you can do to tech versus just fully warding up your board and turning everything sideways. So yeah, more content for it. Definitely got a lot of faith in it, and I think this is a good description of how the meta will shape up. Maybe some of these tier twos will move up a bit, and maybe we will fall down a little bit, which I think is a pretty good thing. And it'll mainly be because a lot of people are playing into us, and they're sort of trying to beat it basically and trying their best to go into the matchup winning it. So hopefully we drop down a little bit, we get ignored a little bit. Don't drop out of the tier 1 or maybe drop just like high tier 2 is kind of where I was hoping the deck would land, sort of tier 1.5 sort of standard. I think everyone's dream for deck building is that the deck lands at a tier 1.5. It's good enough to win an event, but it's not good enough that like everyone's going to practice and tech for. It's kind of like the dream spot you want to be in. Um, so yeah, I'm just gonna keep doing content on the deck.